Every act of creation in Genesis follows the same pattern. God speaks, it exists. Let there be light. Light appears. Let the waters teem. They teem. The commands are swift, singular, and total. And then, on the sixth day, something changes. God pauses. He deliberates. Let us make man in our image. That single shift, from declaration to discussion, has driven theologians to wrestle for thousands of years. And it begins here, at the close of Creation Week, when everything else was already in place. The fourth day arrived in a silence so profound it possessed weight. There was no wind to stir the dust, no pulse of tide against stone, no breath of living thing to break the stillness. The void was absolute, a vast, unmeasured expanse where time had not yet found a rhythm. It was a vacuum of potential, holding the weight of everything that had not yet been. Then, the silence broke. It did not fade. It shattered. A single, resonant command tore through the nothingness. A sound that carried the force of a physical blow. The void recoiled. The emptiness vibrated, unable to contain the sudden surging pressure of the divine utterance. Space itself seemed to buckle under the intensity of the sound. Every point in the darkness shuddered, reacting to the command. The air began to thicken with the promise of what was to follow. Everything held its breath, waiting for the light. The response was instantaneous. At the exact center of the heavens, the darkness collapsed inward, crushed by a sudden, blinding point of pressure. A sphere of fire ignited, white-hot and absolute. It did not merely glow, it erupted, throwing a searing wave of radiance across the infinite expanse. Shadows that had reigned for eons were ripped from their foundations, forced into a frantic retreat toward the edges of the horizon. The light carved a sharp, jagged line through the void, separating the brilliance of the new day from the lingering remnants of the night. Below, the earth felt the impact. The surface, once frozen in the grip of the void, began to absorb the heat. Rocks cracked under the sudden thermal expansion. The ground groaned as it warmed, the soil releasing a faint, rising vapor. Plants, dormant in the deep cold, responded to the stimulus. Leaves uncurled with a slow, mechanical precision, reaching upward to drink the light. The sun held its position, burning with a steady, unrelenting intensity. The shadows had lost their grip, and the earth finally knew the sensation of warmth against its cooling crust. As the sun traced its arc and dipped toward the horizon, the brilliance softened into a deep, velvet indigo. The sky did not return to the chaotic void of before. It settled into a structured, manageable dark. Then, the moon pierced the veil. It appeared not as a source of heat, but as a cool, silver mirror, reflecting the distant radiance of the sun back onto the cooling world. Its surface was scarred with craters and plains, a silent sentinel hanging in the vastness. The effect on the earth was immediate and profound. Below, the oceans, which had remained stagnant under the sun's steady gaze, began to stir. An invisible tether snapped into place between the silver orb and the deep water. The sea groaned, its surface rising in a slow, deliberate swell. Millions of tons of water shifted, dragged by the moon's silent gravitational command. The tide pushed against the shore, a rhythmic pulse that had never existed until this moment. Waves broke against the land with a new, measured cadence, retreating and returning in a cycle that mirrored the moon's slow climb. The water hissed over the sand, leaving behind a glistening, temporary map of the ocean's reach. The sky above the moon was not yet finished. While the silver orb governed the tides, the remaining void still held the potential for infinite depth. Then, the ignition began. Not in a single burst, but in a cascading sequence of light. Stars sparked into existence like embers flung from a great, unseen forge. They appeared in clusters, then in lines, then in vast, swirling patterns that stretched beyond the reach of sight. Each point of light was a fixed anchor, a diamond-hard reference point pinned against the velvet black. They did not flicker randomly. They aligned, forming constellations that mapped the emptiness, turning the chaotic expanse into a navigable field. The darkness was no longer a featureless trap. It became a grid of distance and direction. As the final star took its place, a low, resonant hum vibrated through the fabric of space. It was the sound of gears engaging, the first movement of a celestial mechanism. The clock of the universe began to tick. The heavens were no longer just a backdrop. They were a precise, ticking instrument. The cosmos was complete, a vast, ticking machine set in motion. The fifth day arrived with a command that rippled through the deepest trenches. Where the water had been a heavy, silent weight, it suddenly surged with intent. The pressure of the depths shifted, no longer just a physical force, but a vessel for movement. Beneath the surface, the dark, barren plains of the ocean floor began to vibrate. The sediment lifted, swirling into clouds as the first flickers of life ignited in the gloom. It was a rapid, chaotic awakening. From the crevices of stone and the jagged edges of newly forming coral, the water began to swarm. Schools of fish materialized, their scales catching the faint, filtered light from above. They moved not as individuals, but as a single fluid entity. Thousands of silver bodies darted in unison, weaving through the labyrinth of coral forests that sprouted from the silt. They turned, dived, and accelerated, their collective motion creating a shimmering metallic pulse that cut through the deep. The coral itself seemed to react, its branches swaying as the current shifted around the darting schools. Every inch of the previously stagnant deep was now occupied by this frantic, silver-scaled energy. The silence of the abyss was shattered by the sound of a billion fins beating against the water. Life had claimed the depths, turning the vast, liquid dark into a frantic living tapestry. The frantic silver swarm suddenly parted. The darting schools of fish, once the masters of the current, veered away in a synchronized, desperate retreat. The water pressure changed, rising from the crushing depths like a physical wall. A shadow, vast and impenetrable, blocked the filtered light from above. It was not a creature of the reef, but a titan of the open sea. The surface began to bulge, the water straining against its own tension as the massive form ascended. With a force that defied the weight of the ocean, the whale broke the threshold. It erupted from the depths, a mountain of living muscle tearing through the boundary of air and water. For a heartbeat, it hung suspended, water cascading from its flanks in heavy, rhythmic sheets. The sun caught the spray, turning the droplets into a curtain of diamonds. Then, gravity reclaimed the giant. It fell back with a thunderous impact, the sound echoing like a cannon blast across the expanse. A massive plume of white foam geysered into the air, spreading outward in a violent, churning circle. The sea boiled, the waves rolling away from the epicenter of the crash. Where there had been order, there was now a chaotic, foaming wake. The ocean had been claimed by a force of raw, undeniable power, leaving the surface vibrating. The focus shifted from the churning sea to the vast, empty expanse above. The air, once still and silent, began to stir with invisible currents. Thermal columns rose from the warming earth, invisible pillars of heat that demanded to be occupied. Then, the sky broke its silence. Eagles caught the rising air, their wings locked wide, banking against the wind with precise, calculated tilts. They climbed in tight, spiraling arcs, their heads turning to scan the jagged peaks below. The motion was relentless. From the cliff faces, sparrows emerged in a flurry of activity, their beaks full of dry grass and twigs. They wove their nests into the rock. On the glass-still surface of the lakes, swans pushed off the bank, their webbed feet paddling in unison to create long, trailing ripples. The air began to vibrate. It was a symphony of flight and current, a complex layering of wing beats, sharp cries, and the rushing sound of wind. The sky was no longer a void. It was a living, breathing network of motion, mapped by the paths of those who had learned to master the wind. The focus descended from the heights of the sky to the quiet, undisturbed surface of the ground. The earth here was dense, packed tight by the passage of time. Then, the silence of the sixth day was broken by a low, resonant hum that seemed to rise from the very core of the planet. The dust began to shift. It did not blow away in the wind. It gathered. Particles of sand and clay pulled toward a single point, swirling in a tight, controlled vortex. The ground beneath this gathering mass cracked, the fissures spreading like veins as the earth surrendered its substance. It was a violent, precise reclamation. The soil turned, folding over itself, losing its jagged edges as it softened under an unseen pressure. It became pliable, yielding like clay in a master's hands. The mound grew, rising from the flat expanse, its surface undulating as it was kneaded and pressed into a new, complex geometry. There was a rhythmic, heavy thudding as the earth was struck and smoothed, the material darkening as it absorbed moisture from the deep layers of the crust. The dust had ceased to be mere ground. It was now a vessel, shaped and waiting for the final command to begin its transformation. The form lay still, a masterpiece of clay and dust resting upon the garden floor. It was complete in every contour, yet it remained cold, a hollow vessel waiting for the catalyst of existence. The garden grew unnaturally quiet. The birds ceased their song, and the wind died down, leaving the trees frozen in place. A heavy electric tension saturated the air, vibrating against the skin like the hum of a gathering storm. The light shifted, dimming as if the sun itself had pulled back to witness the moment. God moved closer. With every step, the grass beneath his feet bowed, and the very ground seemed to tremble in reverence. The air grew dense, thick with the weight of the impending spark. It was a pressure that pushed against the chest, a silence so profound it felt like a physical barrier. God leaned down, his presence casting a long, deep shadow over the figure. The space between the Creator and the creation narrowed until they were almost joined. The silence shattered. God exhaled, and a torrent of pure, kinetic energy poured into the nostrils of the clay vessel. It was not a gentle breeze, but a rushing tide of force that struck the interior of the form like a lightning bolt. Deep within the chest, the dry, packed dust began to liquefy, turning from earth into muscle and bone. The ribcage shuddered. A faint, rhythmic thudding started, a dull, heavy sound echoing through the hollow cavity. Then, the first true resistance. The lungs, once solid, expanded with a sharp, tearing sound. The chest cavity arched upward, straining against the stillness. Adam's diaphragm contracted, pulling the air deep into his frame. His skin flushed, the gray, earthen tone darkening into warmth. His fingers, previously stiff and fused, twitched against the soil. The air escaped his throat in a ragged, wet gasp. His chest rose, fell, and rose again. The spark of life had taken root, turning the vessel into a man, a living, breathing entity. Adam blinked. The world rushed in a chaotic blur of emerald green and blinding gold. He reached out, his hands sinking into the soft, damp soil, feeling the grit beneath his fingertips. Every nerve ending fired at once, registering the temperature of the air, the texture of the grass, and the distant, rhythmic rush of water. He tried to sit, but his muscles were unpracticed, trembling under the sudden demand of weight. He pushed against the earth, his knuckles white, and hauled himself upward. Gravity pulled at him, a new and heavy force. He swayed, his balance failing, before finding his footing on the firm ground. He stood. The garden stretched out before him, an endless expanse of towering trees and vibrant, uncurling leaves. He turned, his head spinning with the sheer scale. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, painting patterns on his skin. He looked at his own hands, then back to the horizon, realizing the vastness of the task ahead. He walked forward, his stride tentative, testing the ground. The garden was waiting. He stepped into the light, accepting the weight of his purpose. The garden grew still, the wind dying down until not a single leaf trembled. Adam felt a sudden, heavy pressure settle behind his eyes, a deep, rhythmic fatigue pulling him toward the earth. He collapsed onto the soft moss, his limbs turning leaden, his consciousness slipping into a dark, silent haze. Above him, the air shimmered, vibrating with a low, resonant hum that seemed to pull at the very marrow of his bones. A sharp, localized sensation flared in his side, a brief, clean separation of muscle and bone. He did not wake. He only drifted as the essence of his own frame was drawn away. The air near him began to coalesce, gathering density and form in the golden light. Dust and light swirled together, knitting into a shape that mirrored his own, yet held a different, softer grace. The void in his side sealed, leaving only a faint, lingering ache. The new form stirred, a hand brushing against the grass. A sharp, sudden intake of air broke the silence. Eve opened her eyes, the light reflecting in her gaze. She pushed herself upright, her movements fluid and unpracticed. Adam stirred, his eyes fluttering open to find her standing there. He rose, the weight of his solitude vanishing as he looked at her. They stood face to face, two distinct beings, the first of their kind, anchored to the world by their shared breath. They moved through the garden as one, their footsteps pressing into the loam. Adam led the way, his eyes scanning the dense foliage, while Eve followed, her hands brushing against the thick, waxy leaves of the ferns. They reached a clearing where a creature with iridescent feathers stood perched on a low branch. It tilted its head, watching them with a sharp, unblinking gaze. Adam stopped, his breath hitching as he observed the way the light caught the bird's plumage. He spoke a sound, a soft, melodic vibration that seemed to match the creature's own call. The bird fluttered its wings, settling deeper into the branch, acknowledging the designation. Eve stepped forward, her fingers tracing the rough bark of a nearby tree. She pointed toward a herd of animals grazing in the distance, their movements synchronized. As they shifted across the meadow, together they walked among them, observing the patterns of the wild. They touched the cool water of a stream, testing its flow, and cleared a path through fallen branches to ensure the growth of the saplings beneath. Every action was deliberate, a physical dialogue with the land. They were not merely observers, they were the caretakers of this unfolding life. As they moved deeper into the garden, the weight of their responsibility became a steady, grounding force. The sun dipped toward the horizon, bleeding amber and violet across the canopy. Adam and Eve paused, their work slowing as the light lengthened, stretching their shadows across the cooling earth. High above, the first stars pricked through the deepening blue, mirroring the bioluminescent pulse of the ocean depths. The Creator looked out across the expanse, a gaze that spanned from the smallest root in the soil to the furthest reaches of the burning firmament. The seas churned in a steady, rhythmic tide, pulling against the shore with a sound like a deep, resonant breath. The birds had settled into the cliffs, their calls fading into the hum of the evening. The humans stood in the center of the garden, every element, the light, the water, the living creatures, and the two who stood in the center aligned in a perfect, intricate balance. The Creator looked upon the entirety of existence and called it very good. The final movement of creation reached its zenith, and then, with a sudden, absolute finality, it stopped. The cosmic energy that had been weaving the fabric of the world withdrew, pulling back like a tide retreating from a shore. Where there had been the constant, shaping pressure of the divine, there was now only the steady, self-sustaining pulse of the world itself. The Creator stepped back, the act of making finished. The mountains stood firm, no longer being molded by unseen hands. The rivers continued their descent, gravity taking over the task of movement. The stars hung in the void, fixed in their positions. Adam and Eve stood in the center of the garden, their own breath rising and falling in the cooling air, no longer guided by the immediate presence of the architect. The atmosphere shifted, the frantic, vibrant hum of the last 6 days settling into a heavy, resonant silence. The Creator looked upon the stillness, the hands that had shaped the earth now resting, the work of the 6 days sealed and set in motion. A profound, holy stillness descended, wrapping the world in a mantle of absolute peace. It was not an empty silence, but one saturated with the weight of completion. The wind dropped, leaving the leaves of the garden motionless. The water in the stream slowed to a gentle, glassy glide, reflecting the sky without a ripple. Adam and Eve stood beneath the canopy, their movements stilled, their eyes fixed on the horizon where the last light faded. Every creature, from the smallest insect in the loam to the birds perched in the high branches, held its place in the quiet. The earth itself seemed to settle, the soil cooling and firming under the weight of the new day. There was no urgency, no command, no task left unfinished. The air held a quality of sacred reverence, a clarity that made every blade of grass and every stone stand out in sharp, singular relief. The world breathed in unison, a singular organism resting in the wake of its own birth. The silence deepened, becoming a sanctuary. The stillness did not signify an end, but the beginning of a perpetual cycle. As the earth rotated, the sun climbed the eastern horizon, casting long shadows that marked the first hour of the new age. This was the rhythm now. Light followed by dark, heat followed by cool. High above, the moon shifted its position, and the oceans responded instantly, the water swelling against the continental shelves in a slow, rhythmic heave. The tides moved with a precision that would never falter. On land, the plants responded to the light, opening their pores to the air, drawing nutrients from the soil in a silent, constant exchange. The birds took to the thermals, their flight paths dictated by the invisible currents of the wind. Everything that had been formed now operated under its own internal logic. The seasons began their slow turn. The stars tracked their paths across the night, and the cycle of growth and decay took root in the earth. Adam and Eve watched the sun complete its arc, witnessing the first full rotation of the world. The gears of existence had locked into place. The world was a living, breathing mechanism, self-sustaining and harmonious. The rhythm was set. The cycles of the world continued, but the urgency of creation dissolved into the sanctity of the Sabbath. Adam and Eve stepped back from the fields, their hands empty of the day's labor. They walked to the edge of the garden, where the forest met the sea, and sat upon the cooling earth. The constant hum of the wind through the trees softened, and the waves against the shore lost their sharp, rhythmic edge, lapsing into a gentle, rhythmic wash. This was the hallowed time. It was a pause built into the foundation of existence, a deliberate cessation that honored the work finished. The sun hung suspended in the sky, casting a golden, unmoving light that seemed to hold the world in a state of grace. No creature stirred with intent. The birds rested in the thickets, and the fish drifted in the quiet depths. The humans watched the horizon, their breathing slow and synchronized. The Sabbath claimed the earth, turning the frantic energy of the previous days into a profound, enduring peace. Everything that existed held its breath. The seventh day did not fade into the past. It expanded, wrapping the world in a mantle of permanent calm. The boundaries of time seemed to blur, leaving only the resonance of a task perfectly fulfilled. Above, the stars remained fixed in their constellations, silent sentinels over the garden. Below, the earth held its warmth, a steady pulse of life that required no further intervention. Adam and Eve remained in the quiet, their presence a testament to the harmony of the design. The air carried no tension, only the clarity of a finished masterpiece. Every element of the universe, the vast oceans, the towering peaks, the smallest leaf, existed in a state of absolute alignment. There was no dissonance. The Creator's work stood complete, a tapestry woven with light and life, now left to endure in the stillness. The world breathed as one, a singular, living entity held in the palm of eternity. A profound, sacred balance settled over the horizon, sealing the work of the 6 days into an everlasting peace. The clock of the universe ticked on, but the urgency had vanished, replaced by the quiet, radiant awe of a world that was, in every sense, very good.
If the Bible in video form helps you grow, tap subscribe and join us. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.